Compare Exodus 9:6 and 14:9. Someone asked me about this, and I struggled with it. Okay, let's see if we can help you out.
All right, let's see it.
So, picking on puppets now, huh?
And the fit for this video has been Master of Puppets.
I'm not too big of a person to admit I might need help. Let's see here. We need a number for Soxford University. Yeah. All right, here we go. Hello?
Hello, you've reached the operator at Soxford University. How can I help you?
Yeah. Well, I need to talk to the smartest person you have.
I see. Well, that would have been Dan McClellan, but for some strange reason he decided to go to a rival university.
Oh. Well, who's next?
Probably Tammy in apparel, but she's helping out at the registers at the moment.
Oh. Is there anyone available?
Well, there is one guy, but he's a little, unorthodox.
Well, that's fine.
Okay, please hold while I connect you.
Connecting.
There's an axolotl on the pink stairs. Is an axolotl supposed to... Hello, Bubba's Bible Helpline.
Hey, so I'm having a problem. I was hoping you could help.
Well, sure, I'm always happy to help. What you got?
Well, I know a lot about the Bible, but there's still a lot of stuff to learn, and I think I'm kind of out of my depth a bit here. Maybe you could help me.
Okay, what's going on?
It's one guy.
Okay, is he credible?
His credibility? Oh, well, I mean, he wears really awesome shirts.
Oh, social media loves
Yeah,
that.
I mean,
So he's popular.
and he has a lot of atheist followers. I mean, people who have atheist followers can't be wrong, right?
Yeah, actually, quite often.
Oh, they can't.
Most of the time, actually, atheists are some of the most dogmatic people on social media.
Don't the shirts give him any credibility?
Well, just 'cause you have a cool shirt or a fancy piece of paper in a frame on your wall doesn't automatically make you right.
Well, then why is he obsessed with them?
Who knows? It could be just for fun, could be an ego thing. I mean, some people get their kicks out of arguing with puppets on the internet.
Okay, well, here, let me send you the video, and then you can maybe help walk me through it.
Okay.
All right, hold on. And send. Okay,
Okay, I'm downloading it now.
let me know when you got it.
Okay, I got it.
Okay, walk me through it. I mean, clearly he's wrong, but honestly, sometimes even teachers need help.
Well, of course.
Not all teachers know everything, right?
Well, actually, there is a teacher sent to help us that does, in fact, know everything. But let's see what Dan has to say.
All right, let's see it.
9:6 says, "And the next day the Lord did this thing. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one of the livestock of the people of Israel died." Then the next passage says, "The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and his horsemen, and his army, and overtook them, encamped by the sea, by Pi-hahiroth, in front of Baal Zephon." Sometimes the Bible has fun names. Okay, so I think the supposed contradiction is that the animals died in the first passage, but not in the second one, and suddenly had horses. Okay, well, the key word here is livestock. Think of the word stock, like chicken stock or beef stock. It has to do with food. It has to do with eating.
No, it doesn't. Livestock uses the word stock in the sense of supply or store.
Well, yeah, that's the general etymology of the word stock, but when you qualify it by saying it's livestock or beef stock or chicken stock or something like that, what exactly is being kept in store?
Because livestock refers to living things that are kept for use or for profit. For hide, for milk,
Milk is a food item.
for meat,
So again, for food.
for sale, or something like that.
Well, yeah, because its primary value in terms of sale is the fact that it can help you produce food. I mean, it does do things like produce clothing, say leather or wool from sheep, and it can help you plow a field so you can grow more food. But primarily, the reason why livestock is different than, say, I don't know, a jar of cockroaches is because of its ability to help you eat and consume.
It has nothing to do with eating.
You just listed milk and meat. That very much has to do with eating.
And beef stock and chicken stock use the word stock in an earlier sense of the same root, which referred to fundamentally the trunk or root of a tree or something like that. And so the idea was this was the foundation, this was the origin, this was the source of this stuff. And so beef stock and chicken stock are stuff that are founded or originate in parts from these animals.
But the chicken and beef that you're referring to there is the meat of those animals as food. I mean, we don't refer to it as cow stock, we refer to it as beef stock. It is a food item that is being stored.
So stock doesn't have anything to do with eating. Stock means this is the origin, this is the source, or this is a supply or store for something.
And that would be fine if we were only talking about the word stock. But we're not. There's a difference between, say, certificates that are exchanged on the NASDAQ and cattle that is kept at a ranch. That's why they call that livestock, because you've qualified what it is that you're storing in value, and in this case, you're qualifying it by designating it in a special category of things that are used for food and other valuable types of resources, but food is the primary one. But ultimately, this argument by Dan is just a giant verbal sleight of hand. By getting the viewer to ignore the qualifying term and focus instead only on the word stock, he can then trace the etymology to show that it doesn't connect to Dinks's arguments, but that's not really what Dinks the puppet was making as his overall main point. Ultimately, what Dan is doing is deceptive. He's basically creating a giant red herring to distract people from Dinks's real argument, which is that there is a special category here of animals that is different from the war horses that are being kept in the stables. And that's why many biblical scholars and qualified translators have specifically chosen the English word livestock in order to convey that we're talking about a special category of animal, not all animals in general, because the context indicates this. And that's ultimately the idea that Dinks the Puppet was trying to convey with his video, despite Dan's attempt to sidestep that with a verbal red herring. But when you watch Dan's reply to the actual overarching argument, Dan doesn't even really disagree with Dinks, and he even says as much in the video. The word that is being translated here as livestock in English is the Hebrew word mikneh, and this is what Dan has to say about this word.
I don't think that it makes much sense to include war horses within this designation of mikneh that were destroyed.
Well, that's pretty much the essence of what Dinks's video was saying. He's basically stating what the translators state, is that we have a special category of animals here that are not the same as the war horses that later get drowned in the Red Sea. And so Dan basically just agreed with the premise of Dinks's entire video. Now, Dan does point out that horses are explicitly mentioned in the context of the term mikneh in Exodus chapter 9, but let's take a look at that.
So the word in Hebrew is mikneh, and this fundamentally comes from a verbal root that refers to acquisition or purchase. And mikneh refers to animals that are kept as livestock. And so here is the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament's entry on the word mikneh. You look almost halfway down, you see an M dash and a 2, mostly livestock as property, because this word can also be used to refer to land as property. And the types of animals that are included in the usage of mikneh would be cattle, sheep, flocks, camels, donkeys, beasts of burden, things like that. So it wouldn't really normally include horses.
And in the Bible, mikneh is almost always used for some sort of livestock, and you have to look at the context to see if it's being used in terms of property or some other type of possession, but that's very rare, and it's the context in this chapter that tells us what type of mikneh is being referred to, as we're about to see.
However, in this case, it explicitly does include horses, because the threat that is given in Exodus 9, 2, and 3 says, "The hand of the Lord will strike with a deadly pestilence your livestock in the field," and then appositionally, that livestock is cataloged. The horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks.
But the context of that word mikneh here is animals that are in the field, and that word for field in Hebrew is sedeh, which is a reference to domesticated agriculture, a farm field. So we're talking about specifically animals that are farm animals or livestock. And the fact that we're referencing these as the horses of the field, that tells us that these are farm horses, beasts of burden. not war horses, not the horses that are kept in stables and controlled by the army and kept in the city and run by soldiers and so forth. And as we already saw earlier, Dan himself acknowledges that.
Now, you could say, well, those are the ones in the fields. Those aren't the ones in the stables. And that's debatable, but livestock can include horses.
But that would be a subcategory of all horses in general because these are the horses of the field. And you yourself have already indicated what side of that supposed debate you fall upon because you said that you don't think war horses are included in this context. And I agree. We can see in the very next plague that's listed in the chapter that boils break out over both man and beast throughout the land of Egypt, not just the fields, the Eretz Mitzrayim. So there are animals that are still within and throughout Egypt that are of a higher categorical reference than just the beasts of the field. But then Dan goes on to bring up another appearance of a contradiction that was never even brought up or discussed in Dinks's original video. But I guess that's because Dan's favorite food item is a red herring.
But you don't even have to get outside of chapter 9 of Exodus to see a very clear contradiction regarding these mikneh, regarding the livestock, regarding the cattle. Because if we go to Exodus 9:6, we have all the mikneh of Mitzrayim, all of the cattle or the livestock of Egypt were killed. And then we get the next plague.
No, the next plague is boils, as I showed earlier. Dan skipped one. It's the plague that comes after that Dan is now talking about, which is the plague of hail.
And the threat is here. And now send and bring in all of your mikneh, all your livestock, all your cattle, and all that belongs to you in the field, every human and every beast which is found in the field that is not brought into its house, hail will fall on them and they will die. But wait, they already died in verse 6.
Did they really, though? Let's take a look. Remember that the plague of livestock at the beginning of chapter 9 is specific to the livestock that are in the field. But we know from the next plague that there are still animals, at least, that are throughout the land of Egypt, which again is different than the field. And that would include wild animals, but it would also include animals that were in the city or in people's homes or at the marketplace. All of the animals that were in the field were not all of the animals of Egypt, period. And those other livestock that survived this plague could certainly have been brought back out into the fields later on after the death of the first animals. And so when it says in verse 25 that hail struck down everything that was in the field, and both of man and beast, that doesn't mean it's the same animals that were in that earlier plague. This could be an entirely different set of animals to restock the fields. But Dan is quick to point out that back in verse 6, it appears to suggest that all of the livestock of Egypt died, as we can see here.
And on the next day the Lord did so. All of the Egyptians' livestock died, but none of the Israelites' livestock died. Okay, so they're all dead.
But the problem with suggesting that that means that all the livestock everywhere in Egypt is dead is that that is ignoring the context that is laid out in verse 3 of this plague being a plague of the livestock in the field. Think about it if I said it this way. Supposing I was to describe to you the attack on Pearl Harbor during World War II. Now, I know that there were some American aircraft in Hawaii that are actually able to get airborne, but let's pretend that all the American aircraft were destroyed in that attack on the ground, and that the Japanese will also pretend they didn't suffer any losses. So if I was to say to you, in the context of the Battle of Pearl Harbor, that all of the American aircraft were destroyed and none of the Japanese airplanes were lost, or all of the aircraft of America were wiped out, but none of the Japanese aircraft or the aircraft of Japan were wiped out, you would understand that I'm talking in context of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Not all of the aircraft of America in general, not all the ones that happen to be in the continental United States, because I set forth the context of what I'm referring to ahead of time. So when I say that all the aircraft of America were destroyed, but none of those of Japan, you know I'm only referring to the context of this battle. And the same is true with this plague. The context of this livestock that is being destroyed is only in the context of those animals that are in the field, as we saw in verse 3. So when it says that all of the Egyptian livestock were killed, but none of the Israelites' white livestock were killed, you should know what I'm talking about if you're honest with the text. And think about it. This doesn't seem to be any problem for the author of this chapter. They seem to understand that there's no contradiction because they don't make any attempt to correct any said appearance of contradiction. And you would think that if they were editing or weaving together different tales in order to make one story, that they would make such corrections if such a contradiction was so glaringly apparent to the people that are reading it, including themselves. But it's not, because it makes logical sense when you read it correctly. What doesn't make sense is them putting this contradiction in the text deceitfully and then ignoring any resolution for it, and then scholars thousands of years later saying this is the only possible conclusion based on no other evidence than their own imaginations and a willful ignorance of what the text is actually claiming, that there's 10 plagues here and there's no inconsistencies. And so that's why Dan has to resort to mockery and throwing out pejoratives and chiding you and scolding you to try to believe his point of view and to try to belittle the arguments that he doesn't agree with, because that's all he really has in his arsenal.
People who wanted to weasel out of it could say, well, all the livestock of Egypt doesn't necessarily mean literally all. It could just mean half or 3/4. It could be hyperbole. It could be rhetoric. There are ways to weasel out of this contradiction for those of you who refuse to see that this is a contradiction, because you have dogmas that demand you dictate to the Bible what it is and is not allowed to say.
And the irony of Dan in the midst of all of his scolding and mockery of viewpoints that he doesn't believe in is that Dan is the one who's trying to make the Bible say something that it doesn't, on the face of it, actually say, and tell you that that is the only thing that the Bible can say. And he bases this on nothing more than his imagination. There's no actual committees that are evidenced in history that piece together these texts from earlier sources. There's no earlier sources that were handed down to us in history that we can see that they were drawing from. There's no names of these people that did this, yet critical scholars will tell you that this is how the Bible came to be, and they'll look at what they think is a contradiction and say, aha, that's the evidence that all of this other editing and redacting and committees and people and so forth existed, even though there's nothing in history that actually shows that other than the imagination of critical scholars who can't seem to resolve what appears to be a contradiction after the fact when it clearly is not, because they want the text to say what they want it to say. They want it to be a contradiction. They want to be that the only way you can understand the Bible is to approach it with doubt and critical mindsets. And that is their dogma, in spite of the data of the actual text that we can see with our very own eyes, which tells one consistent story of 10 plagues occurring and makes no indication that there are multiple authors or multiple texts they're being drawn from. It presents itself as one story, yet they refuse to believe that for the sake of their dogma. Okay, but I'll get off my soapbox now. What do you think, Dinks?
You know, you really should make a living doing this.
And quit my dream job of delivering pizzas? Not a chance.
Okay, I can accept that.
But hey, feel free to call me again anytime. I love sharing the gospel and the word of God. And I can see that you do too.
All right, well, thanks for the help.
No problem.
I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, and have a blessed day.
All right. When you take on a puppet, you get beat by a sock.